Hi, this is Esther with Discover Your Origins. In this video, I'm going to take a look at the 1790 census. Family history research usually begins with the census because it's an easy place to start. It tracks your family through time. And this is particularly true in the United States, but other countries have also taken census records. And the 1790 U.S. Census is the first census that was taken in the United States. There are a number of articles that are written about the 1790 census, and I link to them in my blog article. My blog kind of brings all of these resources together with links to the sources that I used and gives you just a basic comprehensive overview of the 1790 census and how you can use it in your family history. So one of the first places that I go to learn about a census is the National Archives. The National Archives has pulled together frequently asked questions pages and other information about the various censuses that have been taken. The 1790 census is special because it's the first one, and it was taken 3 years after the ratification of the U.S. Constitution. Every census that is taken in the United States is important because it helps to establish the representation in the U.S. House of Representatives. And so that's reconfigured every 10 years based on the count of the population. Over time, that census has been used to determine representation in state and local governments as well. But in the beginning, it was mostly for the U.S. House of Representatives, and it was a simple count. There wasn't very many questions. The law that was passed on how the census was to take place was to identify the head of household of the home and then count how many members were in the home. And it had to be done on a certain date. Of course, the census took longer than 1 day to complete. I mean, we were talking about a pretty widespread population and sometimes rural areas that were still undeveloped, and so sending people out to all those places would have been quite time consuming. There was also controversy and some concern among some of the states, and so they didn't allow the count to take place right away. And so according to this article and some that I read, the count took almost up to 2 years. And so you may be looking at your ancestor and saying, well, wait, they should have been there, should have been included in the count, and they're not. And it may be because of that 2-year spread. There was some concern by George Washington and Thomas Jefferson that the count was not accurate, that it was undercounted, that there should have been more people included. But it is what it is, and so it's hard for us to know in our day how accurate that original count was. And so I think it's pretty safe to assume that there probably are missing people in the 1790 census. Another thing to be aware of is that they did do a count in all of the original colonies, which became states, but some of the states that later developed were included with other states. So like Kentucky was a territory, not a state, and it was included with Virginia in the count. And so you need to consider the geographic location of where your ancestor was living to see if possibly they were included in another state's count. So the questions that were asked on the 1790 census were pretty simple. It named the head of household, then it counted the number of free white males over age 16 and the number of free white males under 16 years old. And then they just counted all of the females. There wasn't an age breakdown. They counted all of the other free persons, and that included free African Americans, and then the number of slaves. And I'm going to show you what the census form actually looked like, but they have an example in this article of the columns that were on the form. There were some states that the count did not survive, and so only if some of the states survived, because of time. They say that Delaware, Georgia, Kentucky, New Jersey, Tennessee, and Virginia was likely destroyed during the British attack on Washington, D.C. during the War of 1812. It's possible that some of the individual census pages for other locations were also lost before they were bound into books in the 1900s. So they were just loose sheets until then. So if you're not finding your ancestor, you need to consider where they were living when you're looking. So you can look at the original 1790 census schedules, and Family Search and Ancestry have the 1790 census. There's also books that have been published that you can look at. All right, so this is just from the National Archives. The Family Search Research Wiki has some additional information and describes some of the problems that occurred for the census, about missing records, websites that you can look at. Wikipedia also has a really good article on the 1790 US Census, and it includes the account that Thomas Jefferson and George Washington were concerned that the true population had been undercounted. And if there had been an undercount, it was because, the population was dispersed, there wasn't very good transportation, limits to technology, and also the individual refusal to participate, which is still a concern to this day, that there are people who refuse to participate in the census. And that's true despite there being laws requiring people to participate. So how many people were counted? And the Wikipedia article includes a chart of all the states. It does give a total number of 3.9 million people total for the entire country. The most populous state was Virginia, and the least populous was Delaware. And then there's a state breakdown of, the records that have survived that we are, know the numbers for. So that's an interesting article, and I have that linked in my blog article. So the question then is, how can this be useful? Because the type of data that is collected seems pretty minimal. You're not going to really learn about a lot about your ancestor necessarily in the 1790 census. So let's flip over to an example. And I have this person, Samuel Brockway, who lived in Connecticut. So I know that he should be in the 1790 census because Connecticut has been preserved, and so he's born in Connecticut, he died in Connecticut, so a pretty good chance that he was living in Connecticut when the census was taken. And sure enough, the sources for Samuel Brockway on Family Search includes a link to the 1790 census. So in my blog article, I talk about the things that you can learn by looking at your ancestor in the 1790 census, and that is to confirm location. It's to identify the number of people in a household, and also to look at the neighbors, the people that were living next to your ancestor. That will help you determine whether or not for sure it is your ancestor, because there are a lot of people that have the same name even in the same locations, and so you want to look at the neighbors. Samuel Brockway is an interesting person because he and his wife, Margaret Smith, had a very public and ugly divorce, and that's recorded in the court records. And so that helps us confirm other information the court records do about Samuel Brockway's location and his family makeup. And so, divorces in the 1700s, while they did happen, they were a little bit unusual. And in this particular case, Samuel Brockway's wife, Margaret Smith, basically left the family and had an affair with a slave or a black man that was in their household and had a child by him. And so their relationship, it's a lot like a celebrity divorce. There was a lot of publicity and whatnot about it, which regardless of all of that was going on with him and his wife, um, the 1790 census helps us confirm who was living around Samuel Brockway when all this was going on. So let me take you to a link of the 1790 census and what it actually looks like. So this is the ancestry page for the 1790 census that shows Samuel Brockway. And before I click through the image to give you a closer look at what it actually looks like, you can see that it looks like a tally sheet, that it's just a list of names with columns and numbers. And that's really all that it is. Okay, so here is a close-up of the census. And you can see that there are page numbers, and then we have the columns. So the first column is the number of white males over the age of 16. The second column is the number of white males under the age of 16. The third column is the number of females. The fourth column is the number of total free people, including Africans. And then the last column is the number of slaves. And so we're in Connecticut, and there were slaves in Connecticut, but most of these people did not have slaves. Okay, so here's Samuel Brockway, and we have two Samuel Brockways living next door to each other. And if we go back to Samuel's page on Family Search, we can see that this Samuel Brockway is the son of a Samuel Brockway and the father of a Samuel Brockway. So there were three Samuel Brockways living in Connecticut. The oldest Samuel Brockway died in 1757, so he would not be listed on the 1790 census. So that means that this census is identifying Samuel Brockway, the one that was born in 1717, and his son, born in 1745. So let's go back. And then you can see that there are, there's the top Samuel Brockway has one male over the age of 16 and one female living in the household. So this is probably the senior Brockway, because he would have been an empty nester basically at this point, and his wife had died. So it's not really clear who this other female is. It could be a granddaughter, it could be a maid, it could be a lot of different people. And so we just know that there's one female in the household. The second Samuel Brockway is the son, and he has three males over the age of 16 and two under the age of 16, and then two females. And if you were to go and look at Samuel Brockway III's page, you can see that there are several children that would kind of fit those categories of still being at home. A pretty good chance that the two females in the home are probably this Huldah Brockway, who was born in 1790, and his wife Lucy. The oldest daughter, Lucy, was already married and out of the house. So even though you don't have the names of those two females, you can infer that those two females are Lucy and Huldah. And then the other boys in the family, you can kind of deduce that, they were there as well. There's 5 boys mentioned total. One of them, it would be the father. So probably the 2 oldest boys could have been out of the house by that point. So you can go through and kind of figure out who those numbers probably match up to. Okay, so what else can we learn about the Brockways by looking at this 1790 census record? Well, one thing that I noticed right away is if you look up a couple of spaces from the older Sam Brockway, is there's a Simeon Brockway. And this is interesting because there were a lot of Brockways in Connecticut, and I cannot place where this Simeon Brockway belongs. Most of the Brockways are descendants of Woolston Brockway, who is the original immigrant ancestor, and yet I'm not sure where Simeon belongs to. And so he's a person that could use some further research. And then you can also go through here and look at the people that were living around them. to see if possibly some of these other people show up in the family later. And there are parts of the census that are not easily read. And so, some of these people on the bottom of this tally sheet are going to be difficult to read. But anyway, you can see that you can learn quite a bit, even though there's just very minimal information in this census record. So the census record source is attached to the Brockways uh, in Family Search, and so you can, of course, click through and look at those. They are linked to the records on Ancestry. So don't be afraid to look at the 1790 US Census. It can give you some useful information about your ancestor. And all of the links and everything that I talked about are included in my blog article on my website, Discover Your Origins. Thanks for watching.